Well, it's very interesting. When I grew up, I grew up. Trinidad is a interesting place because obviously we were a colony that was fought over. Our last colonizers were British. In fact, when I was born in 1958, Trinidad and Tobago was still British. We got our independence in 1962 when I was 4. So my father worked in the oil industry, which was started by the British companies, Apex, British Petroleum. And so we grew up in a slightly privileged area because he was junior management at the time. And the oil field, they would provide housing for their management. Well, in fact, they provided housing for all their workers, but I didn't understand this when I was growing up. But looking back and going through my own upbringing, you could see very clearly the demarcation. So they would have barracks, aluminium kind of barracks for the unskilled workers. Then there was another level of housing for the skilled workers. And then there was another level of housing for the junior management. And then another level of housing for the senior management. The senior management at that time were what we call expats. I call them immigrants, white Europeans, white British. And let's start with the top down. So with the senior management, the workers, the men would have brought their wives here and their children. So the companies provided everything for them. There was a clubhouse and tennis courts and swimming pools, squash clubs, so that a grocery, a commissary, so that they had everything contained. So they were not mixing then with the locals, okay? And then the junior management had their own sports club, recreation ground, no pool, tennis courts they had. And then the skilled workers just had housing, and the unskilled workers, obviously, again, just that. So there was that, I suppose, when you look at it now, sort of apartheid in the sense that there was this separate, but we didn't call it that. We didn't necessarily see it at that. 1970 with the Black Power movement did a lot. Well, I mean, independence did a lot for us in terms of we took control of our destiny. 1970, the Black Power movement came to our shores. And that was, I think, the real kind of start of a consciousness among the people, you know, in terms of their rights and the injustices that went with colonialism. So the oil companies and stuff were nationalized, basically. So then I say through the British, we threw the British out. And people like my father, who was in junior management at the time, having worked himself up through the ranks as apprenticeship, from apprenticeship stages, went into senior management, and we moved into the houses where the white people would have been, and with all the privileges that we had. So my teenage years, we had tennis courts and the pools and the clubs and all of that available to us. And the house that I live in now is still part of that. Yeah, because they sold it to the last people who were living in it. So I live in a kind of almost a protected area, almost like but I live within an oil field area. So I have oil wells surrounding the house. Yes, there's oil wells and stuff, pipelines and stuff in either around, where we live. So we live in an oil field. So it's a little bit slightly different to perhaps some other parts of Trinidad. Trinidad is quite diverse. But saying so, there was that. When I grew up, my teachers were Black, my doctor was Black, my prime minister was Black. So people in power were Black. My parents did an amazing job in teaching us the value of everybody, no matter whether they were on the street or whether they're in highest office in terms of giving value and respect to everybody. They did a fantastic job on that. And so in that transition, we grew up on the camp. There were white families still there. And then there were what we call the Trinidad white or the Creole families, those who were what you call mixed ethnicity, but who were of a lighter color skin, the soft curly hair, etc., who, again, I suppose, tried to pass, they identified with their whiteness more than their blackness. And there, you could sense the pretentiousness in the airs and that. So there was that. But I was grounded enough in my identity, and from a young age, to see these games being played, and I felt sorry for them. I felt sorry for them because I felt, that they were kind of lost, and I thank God for the parents that I had, because we could have easily gone that way, because my father had green eyes, he had blue eyes when he was a baby. My grandparents looked like tanned Europeans, similar, very light color skin, green eyes, straight and curly hair. But my parents ensured that we had a grounding in terms of who we were. So we didn't go down that route. We were very sure of who we were, and there was no kind of a trying to be somebody else. So where did we start with the question? So in Trinidad, I think in all the communities, there is that sort of gradual waking up. Now, in terms of race, the other thing about Trinidad is that we have two predominant races. Or I prefer to use the word ethnicities, because I think we are not one race. Two predominant ethnicities, and that is of East Indian and of African. And the history of that, obviously, the African side of it, as you know, the story, 1492, Christopher Columbus came and said he discovered the West Indies, thinking it was the East Indies. And we have a calypso. In fact, I'm teaching this very thing now in a school, a private school, with a few boys, and we're teaching this history, but through calypsos and poetry. One of the songs that the calypsos is Columbus Lied, by one of our calypsonians called Shadow, and they love it. Columbus lied, he said when he came, there was nobody, but he didn't tell anybody he had to run from the Apache, So there is that. And then after slavery, the abolition of slave trade, and they still needed free labor because they wanted to continue on the plantations. They brought in indentured East Indians. And in the British usual divide and rule thing, the Africans didn't get their 48 acres and the mule that they should have. The plantation owners got their 20 million to compensate for the loss of their slaves. Indentured laborers, obviously, they came in to take over the agriculture. Now, after the African people in Trinidad being bound to the land for 400 years, who wants to be on the land after that, once freedom has come? So the East Indian, the indentured East Indians, geographically it's still the same in Trinidad. They live in the rural areas, the agricultural areas. So they control vast majorities of the land, and still. And then African people were geared to the administrative side of the island. So they form the bulk of the civil service, the public service. So they government jobs and that kind of stuff, right? And it's kind of still similar. It's shifting, more balanced out, but the agriculture side is still very much in the hands of the East Indians. Yeah. Obviously, with climate change and all this kind of stuff going, a lot of more people are going into agriculture, and all those stereotypes and stuff is broken, and a lot more African people are going back to the land. etc. And let me just say, while I remember, that that's Trinidad. Tobago has a totally different history, right? I mean, like, Tobago was just purely African. It didn't get the East Indian component. So they, even how they speak and the culture that they've kept from their African history, the goat racing, the eating of the dasheen and yam, and the hard food, and is different to Trinidad. Yeah. So it's a complex. We're only 1.4 million, but the diversity within that 1.4 million is just astonishing. It's actually quite an interesting place if you needed to study ethnicity and how that has evolved from slave trade right through to now. It's quite an interesting place. So, and then layer on top of that, I should say that there's some Chinese as well that came as indentured laborers. So we have pockets of Chinese people who have now become the business people. So they would have the corner shop and the supermarkets and that kind of stuff. Then we have a layer of Lebanese, Syrian, Portuguese and stuff who came, some of them as refugees from wherever, not as colonizers. Portuguese, but Portuguese, did they colonize Trinidad? No, they didn't. I don't think they ever fought. They may have. I don't know. Everybody fought for Trinidad. French, everybody. But the British won in the last. So you have those people who they used to go around selling their cloth and stuff, who built their businesses. And a lot of those businesses are jewelry businesses now, or cloth empires and that kind of stuff. And then you still have some British people who stayed, yeah, and and mixed with the general population. And then, so in terms of the geography of the country, there are pockets in the north of Trinidad, the northwest, that are very much people of greater wealth, lighter colored skin, and the hair to go with it, and the marinas and the boats and that kind of stuff. And in there, some East Indians who made a lot of money from, land. Or the thing about the East Indian population is that where that first generation were agriculturists, they didn't want their children to be that. So they worked very hard to send their children to university. And so a lot of East Indians are now doctors and lawyers. Doctors and lawyers, you name it, doctors and lawyers. Everybody wants their son to be a doctor to be a doctor. Okay?
This is a very complex and surprising history because I grew up with one of my friend's dads was from Trinidad, I believe. I can't remember if it was Trinidad or Tobago, but he's from one of them. It was a long time ago. I'm not really in touch with him anymore. And he was so fun. And I did not know. I knew, of course, it's in the Caribbean, so the history is just a very complex and layered and everything. And I do want to talk about it more, but we have so many more questions.
Sorry.
I just want to make sure we're respecting our time, and there's just so many more questions. But you gave me a lot to work with, though, and I really appreciate it.
Before we move on from there, let me just make one point.
Yes.
Reflecting the ethnicities in the country, we have two main political parties. One that has predominantly East Indian membership, and one that has African membership. And when I was growing up, yes, there was distrust and that, but it was on a small scale. People mainly live in peace across the ethnicities. And carnival time, everybody got together, our holidays, everybody gets together and celebrates each other. We celebrate Eid, we celebrate Diwali, we celebrate Christmas, everybody celebrates everybody else's. But the East Indian Party finally came into power years after independence, years after becoming a republic for the first time. And then only then, when I came back to Trinidad on holiday in those periods when I was visiting, I was hearing the term Indo-Trinidadian and Afro-Trinidadian. It is not something that was ever in our vocabulary when I was growing up, that division. And so we call it race politics. So, so there's that divisiveness, because I think that's the question you asked me, whether there's a divisiveness in the races, has been driven more top down by the political leaders creating that, rather than from the community itself. I think the community itself left its own devices, would live quite harmoniously. There's a lot of intermarriages, whatever, but the politics is forcing this divisiveness, which has become quite ugly, and it's a shame. It's a shame, because we live in a paradise, seriously a paradise.